Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Optimizing Productivity in a Time of Hybrid Work. I'm Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's program is sponsored by Amazon Business. Our speaker today is Linda Gratton. Linda is a professor of management practice at London Business School and a regular contributor to MIT Sloan Management Review. Linda, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. And it's a real pleasure to be talking to people all over the world on what I think is an incredibly interesting topic, which is how do we ensure that at a time of real flexibility, we can also remain productive? And that's really what I'd like to talk about today. You know, it's obvious that we're all on a journey. If I could see you now, I would show you my diary. I kept a diary from the beginning of the pandemic. I'm now on volume 6. And of course, today with the great news that we have the possibility of a vaccine, then suddenly things are looking better. But you know, as we look forward, one of the things we're all saying is, how do we move into building back better? How do we build off those hybrid work experiments that we've been doing? And how do we really understand the sort of way that we're going to be living in and working in the years ahead? You know, I think that as we think about work, we often, certainly during the pandemic, have thought a great deal about place. Where am I working? Many of us would have had a workplace, an office or a factory or a hub that we have nearby us, or maybe working at our client site. But many of us have now moved that axis of hybrid work from a workplace to our personal space. Today, for example, I'm talking to you out of my home, actually my dressing room, in fact, in Primrose Hill in central London. So I've been working at my home now since March, as many of you are. But of course, our personal space could also be the coffee shop down the road. It could be an Airbnb that we decide to rent and stay in and work from. And in many ways, I think that during the pandemic, we focused on place as the main axis of hybrid work. And we've said, CEOs have said things like, everybody's now going to work from home for the next couple of years, or everybody's now got to come into the office. Which of those are right? Well, as I'm going to show, neither of them are completely right, because we also have to think about one other aspect of the axis of hybrid work, and that's time. Because it's not just place that's changed, it's also time. And I'd like to think about that from synchronous to asynchronous time. By synchronous, I mean time when you are working at the same time as your co-workers. And that was relatively easy in traditional working patterns because it would be 9 to 5. So if you work 9 to 5, and all your other co-workers work 9 to 5, then you were synchronous. You were working at the same time. It's the same thing with Christmas. You know, we don't have to a year in advance say, hang on, what day is Christmas going to be? Because we all synchronize around Christmas. The same thing is true, of course, on the other side of the axis, which is asynchronous time, where in fact you're working at a time when your other colleagues may not be working. So if, for example, you're a morning person and you really like working first thing in the morning, maybe you get up with the sun at 6 in the morning, then you're not going to be working the same time as others. Now, of course, as organization globalized, and many of you, I guess, come from companies that might well have customers or colleagues in other parts of the world, place and time had already begun to change. So for any global company working across time zones and across regions, you'd already begun to change the way that you think about that. But what we're seeing now is what I could only really describe as a complex dynamic. And what I mean by that is, you know, we're moving in so many different directions right now. If you think that your traditional working place and working style was in an office from 9 to 5, then many of us had already begun to change the way that we work with regard to time. In other words, we were still in our office, we still went to the office, but we didn't always go into it in the same time. And others of us were still working on 9 to 5, but we were doing it anywhere. We were working in the office, we were working at home. But what we're seeing now is we're moving up to that top right-hand corner. We're now working anywhere, anytime. And the question I'd like to pose today is, what does that mean and how do we think about it? Now, in many ways, when you think about how is it you want to work, perhaps the question that's on your mind is, what's your preference? You know, it may be that you're at a stage in your life where you want to work from home. It may be that you've got the sort of personality that you like, you're gregarious, you like to have other people around you. There could be a whole raft of individual choices that are made because of you. And I think it's right and proper that in the coming year, as we go from, to use that old change parallel, from frozen to unfroze to refreeze, as we go to that refreeze, it's right and proper that what it is individuals need and what they want and what they expect actually begins to shape the way that we work. But I'm going to suggest there's one other thing that we need to take into consideration, and that's the job itself. It seems to me that in this conversation about hybrid work, we've said quite a lot about what we want. I'd like to make the case today for what the job wants. Now, all of us want to be more productive. We all work in organizations that would like us to be more productive, both as individuals and as team members. And indeed, as we face what could be a very tricky recession, productivity becomes even more important. So what is it that makes us productive? Well, you know, my guess is there's many models that you use on productivity. This is actually a model that I built many years ago when I wrote a book called Hotspots, which really looked at how productivity is increased in dynamic, agile organizations. And this is what I suggested. I suggest that to be productive, each one of us has to do 4 things. Number 1, we have to be energetic. And we know right through COVID, by the way, that some of us are feeling quite a lot less energized. Second, we need focus, particularly if you've got a job where there's much that you have to do on your own, where you really have to focus in on getting a task done. I'm a university professor, so quite a lot of my work is focused work. I sit at home on my own with the door closed, writing articles for Sloan and writing books. For many of you, your productivity will come from coordinating with other people. So what I mean by that is you're working on a task together and you need to coordinate who does what to make commitments to each other and so on. But there's also a 4th aspect of productivity, which we know to be absolutely crucial. In fact, the book, The Hotspots, was written about this piece specifically, which is around cooperation. And that's to say, you know, what is it that working with others brings? That would be, you know, the serendipitous moments when you bump into somebody and you become more innovative. You have other ways of thinking. You cooperate around something that's important. Let's take another look at that, both in terms of what happens when this works and what happens when it doesn't work. And it's the doesn't work that I want to also ask you to think about, because one of the hypotheses I'm going to talk about today, and by the way, this presentation is really a series of hypotheses, is that as we do trade-offs about the way that we work, some of these negatives are going to be part of that trade-off. So the negative of energy is that you're tired, you're apathetic. The negative of focus is that you're distracted, your attention becomes very scattered, the negative of coordination is that you become divided and disjointed in terms of your task and the team that you're working with. And indeed, the negative of cooperation is that you're resisting working with each other, and you also might even move into infighting. So what I'd like to do now is to launch the first poll. And the first quick poll is simply this: select only one. Now, I know that all of these sources of productivity are really important for you, but if I were to ask you, which is your key source of productivity, if you didn't get this right, you wouldn't do your job properly. Is that, number one, being really energetic? Number two, really focused on the task in hand? Number three, coordinating with other people? Or number four, cooperating and sharing ideas? Which is the one that's most important for you now? Aha, so at the moment, let's just take a look at that. Almost 50% of you are saying, I need to focus on the task in hand. 24% are saying it's all about cooperation. 16% are saying it's about being energetic, and 11% are saying it's about coordination. Well, the first thing I want to say just about that quick poll is that that's going to differ across individuals. So one of the questions that I'm interested in is, if you take a look across your whole organization, how do jobs differ with regard to what makes individuals and what makes that job productive? But for right now, for MIT Sloan participants, and let's face it, that's going to be a very particular group of people who have chosen to be here today, then it's the big one is focus. Like me, you think, and I would say the same for my job, but by the way, that I need to be focused. Quite a lot then are saying, I need to be cooperating with other people. And of course, we already see that as being interesting, because that's very different. Focusing is very different from cooperating. And then some of you are saying it also is about energy and it's about coordination. Now, so let's get back to my presentation. Probably need to do it that way. Yeah, here we are. So what I want to suggest is that I'd like you now to put together the two things that I've talked about. So number one, the axis of work is beginning to change with regard to two things, place and time. And the second thing I'd like you to think about is that each of us have our own unique sources of productivity. And that's likely to come from our job, what it is our job requires of us, but it's also might have something to do with the sort of people that we are. And my guess is that if you look across a range of job families in your organization, you'll find that those sources of productivity differ across individuals. And so I think you can begin to see where I'm going with in terms of the line of argument that I'm setting up in today's webinar. And it looks something like this. Now, I have to say that this is my mapping of the trade-offs, and based on what we know about the research in hybrid working, what we know about how people build these levels of productivity. But I have to tell you that this is not coming out of a research study. So this isn't, this is hypothetical rather than the result of a large research project. But I think it's a very interesting place to start. And I want to make 4 suggestions. One is that ask yourself, those of you, well, let's start perhaps with focus. So if I were to say to you, what helps you to be most focused? My guess is that whilst place is important, it's not the most important thing. The most important thing, in terms of those of you like me who said the most important thing is for my productivity is focus, is you need asynchronous time. You need to be able to control your time and to work on your own without others working with you at that moment. Now, you can do that in your office or you could do that at home, but it seems to me that when it comes to focus, it's time that's most important. Quite a number of other people said that they said cooperation was most important to them. And I'd like you to think about, when have I been my most cooperative? And my guess is that it's in a place where your colleagues are also present. Now, that could be an office, it could be that you're working together, in a conference, in a seminar, but basically, cooperation has a strong face-to-face element. Next, a number of you have said, well, actually, what's really important in my work is that I'm energized. When do you feel most energized? And again, my guess is that that's to do with place. In fact, we have early data from this already. People are saying that they like to work in their home primarily because it's more energizing. Why? Well, it means that you are spending less time commuting, and for some of you and some of us, that's 2 hours a day. So that's already time that you've pulled back in terms of energy. You're also saying, those of you who are working from home, I'm more energized because, like me, for example, you can take a walk. I live near Primrose Hill. This is my third webinar today. It's just one of those webinar days. And in between, I have taken a walk up Primrose Hill for every one of them. I couldn't have done that if I was in my office, at least not so easily. And thirdly, in terms of energy, people at home tend to eat better because they're cooking their own food. So I think, this is my hypothesis, that home is a source of energy. And you can see that coordination, of course, is really about synchronous time. You need really to be on the same time as somebody else. You need to share time if you're going to coordinate. But you can see already the trade-offs that all of those bring. So let's say you say, look, the most important thing for me is to cooperate. And I know that for me, being in an office or being in some sort of a place with my colleagues is going to really help me cooperate. But what we also can see from that negative there, that's also going to have negative effects as well as positive effects. So, for example, an office isn't very good for energy. The home isn't very good to cooperate with others because you're not seeing people face to face. Focus doesn't work very well if you're on synchronous time and everybody wants to talk to you at that moment in time. And similarly, coordination doesn't work very well if everybody's working on their own time patterns and those don't overlap. So the point I'd like to make as you think about this is that as we move forward in terms of ways of hybrid working, we have to really map some of those trade-offs that are going to become apparent. And I'd like you to think about, given your sources of productivity, what context works best for you? And again, this is rather cruel because I'm asking you to choose one. And my guess is that as we build hybrid ways of working, you're going to make combinations, but I'd like you to choose one. So given your source of productivity, would you rather spend your time in an office cooperating, or being at home feeling energized, or creating autonomous time when you can focus, i.e. asynchronous time, or ensuring that you've got shared time, i.e. synchronous time, when you can coordinate with others? What context works best for you? So, not surprising, since so many of you said the most important aspect of my job is to focus. You say the context that works best for you is creating autonomous time. Now, you could create that autonomous time in a way that's place agnostic. You could create autonomous time at the office, or you could do it at home. My guess is that you might find that easier to focus at home, but you may have a home environment where it makes it difficult for you to focus, and perhaps going into the office is a good way of doing that. The second aspect that you're talking about in terms of the context that works best for you, again, is about time, the way that we can control time, which is to ensure that you've got shared time when you can coordinate with each other, with other people. And the one that's least important to you, oh dear, maybe this is the end of the office, Paul, is cooperating in the office. So let's take a bit more look at that in a bit more detail. So really, I guess what I'm arguing here is new principles for place and time. What are those going to be? Well, I'm going to suggest 4 principles that you may want to think about as you think about productivity in your organization, in the job families that you're part of. So here is principle number 1. Principle number 1 is design the office for cooperation. And I've been talking to a whole bunch of people who design offices for cooperation, particularly the architectural practice Arup. And you can see that there's a whole way of thinking about the design of office, which means that it maximizes face-to-face cooperation. It enables serendipity. And this is really important. So if you talk to Arup, as I did, about their design of their offices, what they do is they make sure that rather than having elevators, there's wide staircases so people can see each other. Now, I know during COVID, this all seems a bit bizarre, but it will be over. And there will be a time when we'll want to see each other again. So they have a lot of open spaces where people can mingle, can come together to see people perhaps in another part of the organization that's going to be important to them. Because what we know about network theory is serendipity, these wide, weak links, which are much larger than those strong networks, are very important for innovation. That's where the clashes of new ideas come up. And I think third, and this has really come up during COVID, a real concern about how do you get a feeling of the values across in terms of induction, coaching, and mentoring, particularly young people. And I'd be very interested, Paul, in the questions to see if anyone's got thoughts about that. But certainly in the surveys and interviews that I and my team at HSM have been doing, there's a real concern that offices historically are places of cultural artifacts. They're the place where when you go, you sort of understand the place. So if you came to my office, my HSM office in Covent Garden in London, and please do, when everything's open, you'll see it's a beautiful color of orange. It's very open. We have a library. We have wonderful food. And as soon as we bring somebody in, they understand the place. They understand our values. Our values are fundamentally about cooperation. They can see that from the way that everybody's works together on long tables. We don't have individual desks and so on and so forth. So those cultural artifacts are really important to make cooperation work. So principle number 1, if you're in an office, then make sure, design it for cooperation. Principle number 2, if you're at home, make sure it's a source of energy. I have to say, one of my concerns at the moment is that CFOs are coming into this debate and saying, isn't it marvelous that people are going to work from home because it's going to cost us so much less? We just have to remind each other that all that's happening there is the cost is moved from the organization to the individual. The individual still needs a decent desk, a decent IT system, a decent chair and so on. They need a room to work in, they need a door to close. But actually, to make the home a source of energy, here's 3 things that we really have to think about. Number 1, focus on outcomes. As part of really understanding what was happening here, I talked to some companies that have been home-based for a long time, and particularly British Telecoms, which for more than 30 years has been running a series of experiments of home-based working. In fact, years ago, when you phoned directory inquiries at British Telecom, that shows how long ago that was, you'd actually be talking to somebody who's based at home. And they said that when people are based at home, you really need to focus on outcomes. And this is what we've heard many, many times since then. Home-based work, to be a source of energy, people need to feel that you're not watching them all the time. There's no surveillance, but rather people make commitments to tasks they're going to perform, and then they go ahead and perform them. Secondly, there's been some fantastic research on boundary management at home. And what we find is that people for whom working at home is a source of energy are very good at managing their boundaries, both their physical boundaries in terms of setting up their own place, making it feel like their own working station, finding it very quickly to get into a working habit, but also time boundaries. And so the companies we've talked to who are good at supporting people to work from home are very good at saying, we're not going to be contacting you all the time. You're working, we'll agree that these are your working hours, and it's very clear that there are beginnings and ends. The boundaries are negotiated. And of course, commuting is the really incredibly important part of home being a source of energy. I work quite a lot in Japan, and as you perhaps know, those of you who know Japan know that Japanese companies have really struggled with commuting because vast numbers of people work in Tokyo. Some of them commute up to 3 hours each way every day, and yet there was a view that you had to be in the office to be seen, to be present, to be counted, as it were. And now that people have starting to work from their home, the most important source of energy is that they're not commuting so much. Now, will all those people stay at home all the time? I don't think they will. And perhaps one of the questions, Paul, you and I can speak of later is, how many of you out there would like to work from home all the time? My guess is that people will also want to come back to the office, particularly when it becomes a place of cooperation. But nevertheless, it's pretty important that we control our commuting during that time. And some companies, by the way, are doing that by setting up local hubs, neighborhood hubs, so that you can do that. Principle number 3, if you want to boost focus, then let asynchronous time do it. And by asynchronous time, I mean that you have control over your time, and you can put a golden thread in your diary that says "Do not disturb," and that's absolutely crucial. Anybody on this webinar who focuses well will say that the way they do it, and I would include myself here, is they do it by having undisturbed time blocks. The idea that we can multi-process is not true. There is no evidence that humans are good at multitasking. We're fine at multitasking if all the tasks are very, very simple, in which case, to be honest, you can get a robot or an AI to do it. But anything that requires human focus, human imagination, requires you to be undisturbed. So the first principle of let synchronous time boost focus is make sure people have undisturbed blocks of time. Secondly, give them autonomy over the tasks that they do, and make sure from your own perspective you have autonomous tasks. And then also be flexible about energy and work preferences. Some of you really need to focus in the morning. I'm like that, by the way. So if I'm writing a book, I really like to be up by 6 o'clock to work undisturbed for 3 or 4 hours. But others I know would much prefer to work later on. So we've got to be very sensitive to what your energy levels are, but also your work preferences in terms of where you want to work. I have friends who really focus by sitting in a coffee shop. There's no way I could focus in a coffee shop, but they do. So I think we need to realize that we do each have our own preferences with regard to that. Fourth principle, enable synchronized time to be the basis of coordination. What do I mean by that? Well, when you're all doing something at the same time, it's much more easy for you to coordinate. And in a way, that's why offices were so popular, because you didn't need to say to people, oh, let's meet X, at this point or that point. As you walked around, you could coordinate your tasks. As you walked around, you could do in the moment coaching. As you walked around, you could do team catch-ups. So actually, synchronized time as a basis of coordination, you think, well, that's going to be the office, isn't it? But it doesn't have to be the office. It could be virtual. And in the piece the column I wrote that came out a few days ago in Sloan about this fourth principle, you might remember I talked about Ericsson, which is one of the European technology companies, employing hundreds of thousands of people. And one thing they've done is that over a period of 75 hours, they've used a platform, a highly facilitated platform, to bring people to go out together to coordinate along a very complex question that they had about the values of the organization. So whilst coordination and synchronized time appears to be primarily about working from the office, you actually could work from home and still be highly synchronized, but you'd have to coordinate your tasks. You'd have to say, in this period of time, we are going to work together. So what can I do now? And then I'm going to hand over to Paul, and we'll start the questions. Here's 3 suggestions to think about right now. Number 1, keep the trade-offs in mind. As I showed earlier, every decision you make about place and about time has a negative associated with it. It's got a trade-off associated with it. So you have to be really thoughtful about managing those trade-offs. And as part of that, keep the primary productivity, the primary source of productivity in focus. As I said at the beginning of this webinar, my fear is that we are listening a lot to employees about what they want next, but we haven't really taken the job and the productivity drivers of the job into consideration. We now need to do that. Number 2, what I've just described to you is pretty complex because you're moving across 2 dimensions. You're moving across a time dimension and a place dimension. That means you're going to get stuff wrong. So I think this is a very important time to experiment. And I've been saying that quite a lot in my own writing about technology, about job design, about process design. And finally, really think about nurturing your leadership skills, particularly in terms of having leaders who are prepared to be co-creators. So I think it's now time for Q&A. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. We are, not surprisingly, awash in questions.
Oh, really? Oh, good.
Yes, and some great questions. And folks, you can continue to ask questions via the questions module in the control panel. But let's dive right in.
Thanks,
let's begin with talking about our sentiments about the office versus working from home, as you referenced. What is the likelihood that we'll experience a strong bounce back once the pandemic dissipates and that people will want to return to a world of shared locations? We may say we love working remotely in the moment, but feelings have a way of changing as circumstances do. And I just wonder, once we have a choice, perhaps we won't be so enamored. Perhaps there are some psychological phenomena at play that drive us to accept or even celebrate the hand that we've been dealt so far, or maybe we're all just secret misanthropes who really prefer to be alone.
Yeah,
There's about 5 questions wrapped up in there. But I think what we're really getting to is, how do we know what we're dealing with here?
Yeah, isn't that interesting, Paul? And I don't know if you saw that a couple of things happened today with the vaccine. One was, the share prices. It's always good to look at the market as a predictor, isn't it? Did you notice the share prices in airlines immediately went up? And I just saw in the New York Times just now an article that said people really want to get back to flying again. So I agree with you. And that's why from the very beginning, when people said to me, you know, there's a couple of CEOs I advise. I sit on the advisory board, actually, of one of the of a large company. And I said from the very beginning, do not make any do not at this stage say everybody's going to stay at home or everybody's going to work from the office, because it's too early. Paul, you and I have spoken about this before, but Nick Bloom from Stanford, he's the only person who's actually done a piece of experimental work on home working. And remember, those were call centers in China. And what he found is that after 6 months, quite a lot of the people who were working from home wanted to get back again. Now, I spoke to BT about that, because they've got long-term home workers, and they've said that some people really, really like to work from home, partly because of the job they do and partly because of the sort of person they are. So my guess is that I don't think this idea that there's never going to be an office again, I've never thought that was reasonable. But at the same time, you know, going to Japan, as I do quite a lot, all of those people coming out of the Tokyo tube stations and going in rows into their office, I don't see that either. So we are moving into a hybrid world. And the interesting thing about that, Paul, I think, is that we just have to be a lot clearer about what we want. And I'm going to use the word intentionality. That's my sort of buzzword for the day, intentionality. In a way, I don't think we have to think very much about office design or job design. We just sort of let humans get on with it. But now it's become more complex. I think the questions we have to ask is, what is it that the job requires?
Indeed. Beyond the requirements of the job and beyond perhaps even the preferences of individual workers, I think there's a question of fairness with respect to remote work and hybrid work. As there are socioeconomic issues, there certainly is evidence of racial inequality between who is able to work from home and who isn't, what types of space someone has available, family situations, access to superior technology, myriad other factors governed by wealth and affected by privilege. How do we come to terms with that?
Yes, I absolutely agree. And even in Europe, where we have inequalities, of course, but not necessarily to quite the same extent, that's been a real challenge. And for example, you know, one of the companies that's part of our research consortium is Mars. And from the very beginning, they said, Linda, you know, half of our workforce work in factories. And they're going into factories. So when you go on and on about office work and homework, we have a whole bunch of people who have to work. I mean, I have a son, Paul, who's a doctor. He's on A&E at the moment, emergency and accident. And he can't do that from home. He's got to be in a hospital to do it. So I absolutely agree with you that we've got to be incredibly thoughtful and interesting. I mentioned earlier that this is my third webinar of the day. My second webinar, which was to a large consulting practice, was about fairness. I think it's an absolutely crucial question. And what I was reminding myself and the audience is, you know, fairness is about procedural fairness. It's about, you know, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made now. Can we make them in a way that is fair to individuals? So for example, even with regard to homework, if you have somebody who's caring for children or caring for an aged parent and they can't work the same hours as somebody else who doesn't have those caring responsibilities, should they be paid differently? Is it fair that we don't? I mean, you know, you and I again have talked about something I've written about in the column earlier on for MIT, which is that during COVID, women have done more domestic labor in the home than men. Working women, working men, women do more. They've always done more, but they did even more during COVID. Was that fair? You know, was it fair? Because now women are saying, I'm not going to get promoted, people aren't going to notice me. So I think questions of fairness are going to be absolutely crucial. Because, you know, the thing is, if you have a traditional structure where big decisions don't have to be made, fairness, you know, fairness is, or unfairness is already baked into the system. But now so many things are up for grabs in the sense that you can say, we're looking at this again. We're looking at home working again. We're looking at, how do we manage people's time? These all are fundamentally questions of fairness. So I agree with your questioner that these are very, very crucial questions. And the companies that I see that seem to be dealing best with this, and no surprise here, are those that have a strong sense of values.
So with respect to all of the complexities, not just the axes across place and time, but issues of fairness and types of work and all of those things, what are some of the bets companies should be placing now? And conversely, where should they be wary of making decisions that they may be difficult to walk back from?
Well, if I was a CEO now, I would be very careful about making big predictions about where people want to work. And I know that if you look at the tech giants in the US, some of the CEOs have said, you've all got to be at home. Some of them have said, you've all got to come to the office. I just don't think those are going to hold. And I've noticed when I've talked to people who are in those companies, individual employees find that a rather frightening prospect, that either I have to be at home for the next 2 years or I have to be in the office for the next 2 years. I think that what's going to be really important, if I were to make a bet, I would make a bet not on the outcome, but on the process. And the process I would make a bet on is co-creation. I think it's, we've got an opportunity here, Paul, to really build a better world in terms of the way we work. And to do that, we've got to listen to what it is people want, and we have to also listen to what it is the job requires. That's why I spoke briefly about Ericsson. In fact, the earliest webinar I did today was with the head of Ericsson in terms of the change management program. And she was talking about how they've moved into a co-creation process where they've asked hundreds of thousands of people, what are you going to value about what happens next? What are the behaviors that you think are going to be important? And what are the behaviors that you don't want to see going forward? Because actually, this is sort of making me laugh, actually, because it was you won't remember this, Paul, but I wrote a piece for Sloan years ago on signature processes. Do you remember that? It got the Best Article of the Year award that year. And what I argued was that, look, it's great talking about companies, and I do that all the time as a business school professor. I'm always telling people what other companies are doing. But really, fundamentally, each company has to find its own signature. And that's based on its values, its strategy, its demography, its location. And I think that process of finding a signature is where we're at now. That's where I think, I said earlier, just so that you know, I was being completely honest about this. This is volume 6. I don't know if you can see that. Volume 6 of my pandemic diary. And I've been keeping really close notes of what people have been saying. And it's sort of obvious now that we need a process of co-creation to build better ways of working.
Well, first, I can't wait for the movie, The Linda Grattan Diaries. So I think it's going to be a blockbuster.
Anyone's going to be interested.
The notion of hybrid work and the notion of co-creating hybrid work, right? This is, on the one hand, it's really exciting, and it's a way to, I think, build deep engagement, but it's messy. How do you sell the need for this to your board?
Well, I don't think it's that hard, actually. We've been working on this now. I had decided some years ago, Paul, that we needed to build mechanisms of co-creation. And so my advisory group, HSM, built that capability about a decade ago, and particularly around facilitation. So we have not just a platform, but more importantly, masses of facilitators right around the world. And we also use AI. And I don't think we're running 1 or 2 a week at the moment. I don't think any CEO is really going to say, I don't want to listen to what employees are saying. And, it seems to me that we now have the technology to listen to employees and for CEOs to talk about what's happening. And that's just really crucial, because I don't know if you remember the very first webinar I did, which was March the 14th, was at London Business School, and it was about hybrid work. It was basically, I'd written a piece in the Harvard Business Review called On Virtual Working. So of course, as soon as the pandemic came, I got a lot of people saying, Linda, you've written something about virtual work. Tell us all about it. So I did my very first webinar on virtual work, the 3 principles or 5 principles, whatever it was. And I, at that stage, did a poll. And the question was, how are you feeling right now? And one of the responses was, the technology is not working for me. Only 3% said yes to that. That's the other thing, Paul, that we've got to realize, is that this has happened at a time of extraordinary technological advances. The fact that even 5 years ago, we couldn't have used these platforms. They would have been very expensive. We couldn't have joined people up, and now we can. And I think that we've really got to use these collaborative technologies to find ways to listen to what it is people want, but more importantly, as you say yourself, Paul, to engage them in co-creating the future.
So we definitely have some interest from the audience on the technology aspects of hybrid and remote work. I know this isn't necessarily your specialty, but what should we expect from technology and its enablement of remote work going forward? Surely it's more than Slack and Zoom and Microsoft Teams and other collaboration software. Are there emerging tools that have you excited, or what do you think is missing from that suite?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not really seeing anything, but I'd be very interested to hear those of you who are. My focus in terms of technology tends to be on learning technologies, and that has gone, as you know, Paul, really through the roof. I mean, the sort of technologies that are now being used to educate people, to help them cooperate with each other, that I think is where we're going to see really dynamic growth. In terms of platforms, I don't know. I mean, all of us are trying to do the best we can. I mean, I'm amazed at London Business School, for example. We, up until the beginning of the week, had a hybrid teaching methodology. So we had Zoomers and Roomers, half the people in the room, half of them on Zoom, going into groups all over the world. It worked unbelievably well. We were just shocked, because as faculty, we'd been saying no to this for decades. Oh, no, everybody's got to come into the classroom, and they didn't, and it worked really, really well. So I think it's not so much about technology, it's about how we use it now and how we feel about it. And I think what we're going to begin to see is there will be technologies, particularly about how do we learn from each other, how do we collaborate with each other. But I think from a process perspective, the challenge will be, how do we learn the boundaries of it? I, like you, some days I have back-to-back Zooms, and I talk to CEOs, they have the same. It's completely ridiculous and totally exhausting. So we've got to find ways of managing the ebb and flow of our life.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of organizations continue to struggle, right, with this kind of emotional exhaustion that we've experienced, right, which is not just about how we collaborate with each other. There are certainly a lot of other existential issues that we're all dealing with. But yeah. I do think it suggests that how we think about productivity might even be up for discussion, right, in the hybrid world.
Well, one of the things that I teach this wonderful elective at London Business School on the future of work, and I think I'm into my 5th year now. And one of the things I've been saying to my students is that we really designed work from a factory. A factory is really where it all started, wasn't it? The automation, the Industrial Revolution. That's where the idea that people didn't work in fields, they worked in factories, they worked in a very particular time frame doing repetitive work. And actually, even though our work is so different from that now, in the sense that it's become so much more creative, so much more innovative, so much more about cooperation, so much more about focus, as we saw from the survey results just now, the way that we've designed work has hardly changed at all. It's really hardly, you know, if you were to take a photograph of how people work now, it would not be considerably different than it would have been 20 years ago. And so I think we've got to, as you say, really ask ourselves, what is it that we want to do when we work? What role do we want work to play in our life? My last book was called The New Long Life, and in it I looked at the combination of technology and longevity. You know, we're going to live to 100. You'll be working into your 70s, and during a period of intense technological change. And what I talked about there, Paul, in fact, we wrote another piece which also got a prize in Sloan. Not that I'm boasting about. Do you remember the multi-stage life,
Yeah.
which actually showed that people are going to come in and out of work. And what I'd like to be thinking about now, and what I'm beginning to write about, is how would you manage that? You know, how would you manage the role that work plays in your total life? You know, not these huge blocks, but rather where you think about the ecosystem of work, you know, being a freelancer, starting your own business, working for a large corporation, but also using that time periods, that temporal pattern in a different way. I think it's really exciting at the moment, actually, Paul.
I agree. And one of the questions I had queued up personally was on that topic, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, you know, about how the emerging hybrid model will affect the way, one, we think of our own careers and our career longevity, and two, how organizations might rethink age as a factor in employment.
Well, I think that's a really important question, Paul, and it's one I haven't, you know, I'm beginning, so it's interesting for me because I've been going along the narrative of the multi-stage life, and then the pandemic came. And frankly, and you can see that from my own columns at MIT, I've been completely focused on it. I think anyone interested in work who's writing at the moment has completely focused on the pandemic. It's been so extraordinary. People working from home, having kids on the video, all of this. And so I haven't yet made the connection that you're making, Paul, which is such an important connection, which is to say, the pandemic has really focused on day-to-day work, hasn't it? I mean, it's interesting. My diary is a day-to-day diary. I can tell you exactly how many days since the 14th of March. But actually, we now have to also think about ourselves. As we come out of the pandemic, we have to think about ourselves situated in the whole of our life.
Yeah.
And if we can take, and I haven't, maybe this should be my next column, if we can take some of the thinking that we've developed during the pandemic and make it part of our whole life, that would be pretty cool, wouldn't it?
It certainly would open up lots of new possibilities. So,
Yeah.
You know, I'm gonna ask another, because there's interest in it, kind of speculative question that I know, asking this question you haven't had a great deal of time to think about. But having said that, there's interest in this notion of how broader adaptation of hybrid and remote work might prompt organizations to rethink what work gets done by traditional full-time employees and what work gets done through freelance, through contract employees. On the one hand, you could see this kind of removal of space broadening companies' purviews as to the need for or the value in full-time employees, or the inverse could happen, that work that we might have thought fit in the freelance world because it didn't need to be done in the same physical space, or could be outsourced to lower cost locations. Perhaps that way of thinking will no longer be relevant. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And in fact, the next piece I got slated for writing for Sloan would be about that, which is to say that once you say you could be at your home to do this piece of work, then you'd have to ask, well, which home? Which home would they be? I mean, why would they have to be in a home in the UK? Why couldn't they be in a home? And I think we've always understood that with data scientists. So we've always understood that data scientist is a particular role, and they've been very much part of the freelance economy. And when I talk to my colleagues in companies, that's the group that they already see as being freelancers for a whole set. Estonia, for example, has got these clusters of freelance data scientists because of a whole range of clustering questions. But I don't think we've thought about that for other types of work. And as you've rightly said, Paul, as we go hybrid, it will raise more fundamental questions about how work gets done, where it gets done, and actually whether it needs to be done at all. One of the early interviews I did was with somebody who ran a large part of one of the telecoms. And she said to me, and I think if I go back to my diary, I'll have the notes of her interview. She said to me, we just completely realized there was loads of stuff we didn't have time to do. And then we asked ourselves, why are we doing it? I think that's a very interesting question. My colleague Gary Hamel has written that marvelous book, Humanocracy, and he's very, very down on bureaucracy. And certainly the person I was talking to in fact, it was in Vodafone, she said, we've become much less bureaucratic and we don't want to get back to that again. So, there are profound questions of how we do work, when we do it, but also why are we doing this? Why do we have so many committees? Why are we slowing things down? How was it that Fujitsu, one of the great traditional Japanese IT companies, was able to move everybody home in 1 week? That would have been, Japan pretty well, Paul. That would have been unbelievable to think about that. If we'd asked them a year ago, they'd have said, "Oh no, it's a decade. It's a decade." They did it in a week, and I think that's given people a lot of confidence, really, about the speed with which we can move.
I love that optimistic view, that glass half full. I think a lot of organizations, right there, it's almost becoming a cliche, but you hear leaders talking about their 5-year digital transformation plan being done in 5 weeks, right? But it does show us something. It shows us that when we have to, we are capable of doing remarkable things. And you just hope that the best of that stays with us. So my colleague Allison Ryder, who is filtering questions in the background, has flagged one that she really wants me to ask. And I think it's a great question. It begins with a statement. It would be phenomenal to create a group to co-create a model that would optimize productivity. Perhaps this can be kind of an intra-company or intra-industry effort. Are there companies that you've mentioned a few companies, but are there companies that you think are really leaders in this so far?
Well, the group that I'm a member of, and I'm a member of two groups that are trying to do that. One is my own advisory group, the Future Work Consortium, which has 30 companies from all over the world trying to reinvent the future. The second is the World Economic Forum that meets at Davos every year, where I co-chair their committee. And we've brought together a group of 30, and they are stakeholders, really, Paul, because, the thing is, the co-creation of the future isn't just about organizations. It's also about trade unions. It's about civil society. It's about governments. And so we already have a whole bunch of companies in the World Economic Forum Council, and those are companies. And I'm not saying that they're, I'm very careful about saying how brilliant any single company is. But LinkedIn, for example, is doing incredible work with regard to understanding the labour market. IBM is doing extraordinary work trying to upskill and reskill. PwC has just put hundreds of millions into training its own people. So I think, but when I teach my new elective on the future of work, which I will do in a few weeks' time to my MBA students, the one thing I'm going to put into this year, Paul, that I didn't last year, was multi-stakeholder. So to realize that this isn't just about corporations, it's about governments, it's about institutions, because, and I know we're coming to the finish now, this is a rehearsal. And Paul, you know what this rehearsal is for, don't you? Climate change.
Oh, on those words, Linda, thank you very much.
My
Um,
pleasure.
we got to a small fraction of everyone's questions, so I apologize we didn't get to more, but I thank everyone for the wonderful levels of participation. That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you for attending. Thank you so much, Linda Gratton, and thanks to our sponsor, Amazon Business. I hope you all have a great day.